since, I think March, I'm going to met with the person in March, but it's been a while, so it is nice to see everybody. Tonight we're going to be getting, having a presentation, Dr. Hunter's going to be giving a presentation, and,
We can start.
okay, so, I'll go ahead and get started.
Thank you, Dr. McClendon. Welcome as well to all of you. As Dr. McClendon said, it's great to be back in person with everybody. We have hard copies of the agenda. Mrs. Devon is passing those out. I apologize. The agenda was in Word docs. I'm so accustomed to doing everything virtually, I didn't even think to print the agenda out, so that's my fault. I apologize for that. Tonight, we're basically going to be taking a look at three things. We're going to be looking at academic performance across the district as our current reality. We're going to be taking a look at targeted support and improvement and the plan at the high school, and also talking about some literacy resources, and we'll link those three things together for you as we go through. But I'd like to start with academic performance. It's really, really important in a school district that we understand our current reality. And our current achievement data tells a narrative. It shows for us where we are performance-wise in a district K-12. So I'd like to spend some time this evening and show you some slides that illustrate what that data is to paint a very clear picture on where we are. I'm going to start with the elementary grade level, looking at literacy in particular, and I'm going to go building by building. And we'll start with Jacksonwald. These are graphs. They reflect the same grade but different students over a 5-year period. And so if we look over here, all the way back in 2014, Jacksonwald was at 57%, and then we went up and down a little bit, and just in 18-19, we were at 53%. In that situation, when you look at it in terms of a numbers standpoint, that's 47% of students in 18-19 that were not proficient readers. Looking at Lorraine, over the course of 5 years, a similar graph. You can see 14-15 through 18-19. 14-15 at Lorraine was a high water mark. It was 76%. In 18-19, it was 58%. And again, similar to Jacksonwald, over 40% of our students not proficient readers at Lorraine in grade 3, and grade 4, a little bit higher, 67%, but still down from the 74%. And then the third elementary building, Awatin Creek, again looking at ELA and looking at 5-year achievement and growth, same grade, different students. Third grade, high water mark in 14-15 of 79%, down about 10% over the course of the 5 years. Fourth grade, 75%, 71 in 18-19. But I think when you look at all three slides, and while demographics may be a little bit different building to building, the reality is when we look at our students, roughly 30% or more are not reading on grade level by the end of their 4th grade, or really by 3rd grade. And that's the concern. That's the current reality from a literacy standpoint. And one of the many reasons why we've been spending a lot of time as a district talking with you about things like Fountas and Pinnell Classroom, the training, the different resources, because we've identified as a district that if we want to see those scores improve, we need to get the best resources in the hands of our teachers, because we have fantastic teachers. In addition to literacy, we can't just look at literacy and not look at math. The two go hand in hand. We've often heard Dr. Minor speak, and I agree with this completely, that if we can improve literacy scores, we'll see math scores improve accordingly. And there is definitely some room for growth with math. This slide gives you a picture of grades 3 through 8. So this is district-wide. This does not focus just specifically on 3rd and 4th. And we have the arrows there for 18-19. And I think that's the important thing to look at. 3rd grade, 52%. 4th grade, 50. 5th grade, 46. 6th grade, 53. 7th grade, 44. And 8th grade, 34. Overall, all grades, 46%. Again, when you look at the numbers, I think it's very important from a data standpoint, you don't look at how many kids were proficient, you look at how many kids weren't. And so when we look at that collectively, and we see that overall, 3 to 8, over half of our kids across the 3 to 8 spectrum are not proficient mathematicians, that's obviously cause for substantial concern. And a recognition that as a district, we need to figure out what we need to do to remedy that. Oops, sorry, let me go back. Thank you. That'd be great, actually, thank you. Let's look at keystones. No, you're okay, it's all good. It's all good. No, you're good. So, Keystone Exams, and again, keeping with the continuum of, we want to look at our data across a K-12 spectrum, not just isolate at the elementary or just at 5-6 or just at junior high. The high school matters as well. And the Keystone scores are significant and important to look at. And again, when we see 5-year averages here with Keystones, there are some interesting trends. I'm going to start with algebra, which is in the middle. And I want to point out a very important piece here. We've shown Algebra 1 Keystone data before, and some of you may remember those numbers being higher. The reason that number is different from what has been shown in the past is that when we look at district Keystone scores, Algebra 1 is higher because it includes the junior high. And at the junior high, we have our strongest academic students taking Algebra 1. So that funnels into the score. In fact, number-wise, about 1/3 of our students. So when it says 34%, those are just high school students, 9th grade on up, that are taking Algebra 1. And again, 66% not proficient on that Keystone exam. And then looking at literature, we had a high water mark in 17-18, but 70% is still very concerning when you look at that reading piece and students not being able to handle those difficult texts. But again, in 18-19, down to 57%. Let me admit Mrs. Stratton into the meeting. And then biology, when we look at biology, we've actually seen a little bit of consistency, although slightly going down. But again, from my perspective, and you've heard Dr. Miner say this as well, we're not going to be satisfied until we see 100% across the board, because we know that's what our students are capable of. And so when you look at this data collectively, I think it's very important to understand that this is not a teacher issue. This is not a teacher problem. We have amazing teachers in our district. Our data is not where it is because of instruction or anything along those lines. There are other things. And at the elementary level, we've identified the literacy resource piece that we've talked about. At the secondary level, we have to begin to look at some other things. In what ways is scheduling potentially impacting how kids are doing? In what ways are course sequencing, alignment, graduation credits, all those types of things? How is all of that tying together to create some of the challenges that we experience? Looking at curriculum alignment, that's another piece. Oh. Thank you.
Patrick, can I ask a quick question?
Sure.
Back on the Algebra 1 scores, because the junior high students make up about 1/3 of the sample, is that consistent for each one of those 5 years that are listed there?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
So then so there's 1/3 of probably the students who are doing well in each one of these grades that are being tested.
Yes.
It's just that they're not being captured in that number.
That's correct.
Okay.
That's correct. Thank you for that clarification. So why does all of this data matter? This data matters because of that number right there. As a district, we know how much pride that we have in Exeter Township School District and how much that diploma means. And in 1920, 10% of our students did not walk across that stage in 4 years. That's incredibly concerning. Because when you look at the ranking within Berks County, we're tied for number 15 countywide. That's a major concern. In fact, I'm even gonna take it a step further and say it's a crisis.
How many students is that 10% equate to that we did not graduate?
So about 1,300 kids at the high school, correct, Mr. Campbell?
About low 30s.
And so that's a real crisis. And it's something that in my department, working very closely with Mr. Campbell, Mrs. Harris, Mrs. Broadhead, are really working to figure out what are some of the things we can do to ensure that our students are graduating in 4 years. Because all of the data that was reflected previously on those slides, that all contributes to why that number is where that number is. If you're not proficient mathematicians by the time you come out of the elementary grades, if you can't read on grade level by the time you get to Reichten, junior high, senior high, then you've set yourself at a distinct disadvantage of being able to graduate in 4 years. And so that's why when I said a few minutes ago some things about schedules related to program of studies, credits, those kinds of things, those are all things that we're looking at and that you will hear more from in subsequent curriculum committee meetings as we look to figure out what are some things we can do to begin to chip away at that. I will tell you that at the district level, Dr. Miner has been very clear with myself and those of us on that team to say, this is priority number one. There's an expectation that by the end of this year, when our 2021 graduation data comes out for graduation rate, that number better be up. And so none of us at the district level are making any excuses whatsoever for why the number's bad. It's bad. It's a crisis. So we're taking steps to do what we need to do to fix it.
Roger, can I ask another question?
Sure.
In that group, you mentioned, I want to say Joey, but I'm going to say Mrs. Broadhead. And Mrs. Harris. Is there a consistent theme that those 30 students are they all have IEPs or some other special education plan?
It's a great question. They don't all have IEPs, but there is a significant portion of them that are students with IEPs. And so, we're really looking at things like transition. Do we have adequate transition plans in place? Looking at things like work study, school to work, increased internships, those kinds of things, because we have to be creative. Big problems require creative solutions. And so we have to look at other ways to get our students the credits that they need to be able to graduate, because not every student needs a traditional pathway from a credit standpoint.
I just want to follow up on that. So the reason that I think that Dr. Winters referenced Mrs. Broadhead and Mrs. Harris specifically is he's going to talk about our TSI designation, which ties directly into special education. But the representation of our students, across all of those data points includes a certain number of special education students, but it is certainly much broader than that. So I don't want anyone to think there was the impression that it's, a special education issue by any stretch.
That's a great point. This is a all kid, every kid
Could
issue.
you repeat the questions, please, so that those of us who aren't there can get them?
Yes, Mr. Fiddler, the last question was from Mr. Ahrens, and he had asked if within those 30 kids that represent the 10% that didn't graduate, how many of them were students with IEPs? And so we just spoke and said that while there is a percentage of that, this is really an all-kid issue. It's not specific to special education.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Yes, Dr. Herring.
Just to clear something up in my head, and I apologize if this is ignorant of me, are you trying to make correlation between the lack of proficiency and the 10% that did not graduate? So you're saying that 10% that did not graduate, you feel it's because, I'm trying to make that connection.
I would take that as well. So I think that they're actually, Dr. Winter is saying the culmination of being in Exeter or any school district from K to 12 is you get a diploma, you graduate, that's obviously all of our goals collectively. And there's certainly something to 10% of students who aren't getting there, potentially coming to that table with weaknesses in reading, with weaknesses in math, that we can trace back throughout the years and those proficiency levels. And so we want to be be really clear when we're talking about graduation rate, that it's not exclusively a high school issue, right? There's fixes or things that we need to look at the high school, but by the time you get to 11th grade, 12th grade, that's years and years and years that you're building upon, right? And so we want students to be successful. However, I think what we have to be very clear about is that there may be students who did graduate who aren't proficient in math, who aren't proficient in reading. When you see those numbers be so low early on, that this isn't, inclusive necessarily of there aren't students who still leave us with a diploma who are struggling readers or struggling in math. So I think the issues are connected in that our entirety of K-12 has to be really strong, and we have to build foundations in reading and math to help make sure that students can get to that point. But I don't think that 30 students necessarily encapsulates every student who has in fact earned a diploma, but has, long-term concerns in reading and math. And I think looking at that 5 years of data, and of course, I don't remember Dr. Winter was mentioning, but I just want to make sure that we're clear. We don't have data from last year because of the pandemic, so we're, obviously behind a little bit in terms of the numbers that we can offer. But there is a bigger concern that maybe isn't even captured in the graduation rate that it's hard to discern, what the actual proficiency. I think it's probably better captured in those Keystone numbers where you could see, kids who are struggling to pass the literature and kids who are struggling to pass the math. So while the math exam scores that are previously shown rightfully show higher numbers, when you look at that group that just takes it at high school, it is a different population of students. And for that population of students who math isn't a strength, we're not getting them over that line, and they may still be earning diplomas. So I think it's a little bit, both, Dr. Herring. Does that answer your question?
It does, thank you.
You're welcome.
Also, if I may ask, do we know the statistics for prior years of graduation, what percentage we were at those
Yeah,
times?
well, last year's rate was approximately the same, so it's been a pretty consistent 10% over the last couple of years, but we can get the 5-year number as well.
Thank you.
Yep, okay. So, the first, piece, and I'm gonna you can kind of picture this as a triangle where all three pieces go together. The first piece of that triangle is the data. And so, the first portion tonight was to help paint a picture for you of what our data looks like as a district over 5 years in some instances, most recent graduation data. And what it illustrates is that there's a problem. There's a problem with proficiency. There's a problem with doing the things that are needed to get our students over the hump, so to speak, in different kinds of ways. And one of the subgroups that we have some struggles with is our students with disabilities subgroup, which has put us into a designation called targeted support and improvement. So I'm going to switch to another slide deck to So let me just say a word of transition, and then I'm going to hand the baton to some other folks that are part of my team to walk you through our plan a little bit. So as a school in Pennsylvania, on a yearly basis, schools, and it's not a designation you want, but schools can receive a designation because a certain subgroup within their building does not meet the state benchmarks in items like attendance rate, graduation rate, ELA achievement, ELA and math growth. And those designations are CSI, ATSI, and TSI. TSI stands for Targeted Support and Improvement. ATSI is Additional Targeted Support and Improvement, and CSI is Comprehensive School and Improvement. CSI and ATSI, the plan gets submitted to the state. TSI does not. It's a local plan approved by the board, which is why we wanted to present it this evening, because it is on the workshop agenda for approval next week. So at this time, I'm going to hand things over to Mrs. Devon, our supervisor of literacy, who's going to talk about the process we used in putting this plan together.
Absolutely, thank you. And do you want to turn your computer to try and capture other voices? I don't know if we can pick up more people on the mic if we turn. I'll try and project really well. So I wanted to start out just explaining a little bit about the process of bringing together this targeted support and improvement plan. And it coincided with our cycle for comprehensive school planning. So the timing worked out very well in terms of a process that we were already
Can't hear
going
the
through.
speaker.
Why don't you come up?
Give me a
Sure.
prompt, you come up front, I'll stop with you.
Make sure I have one. Is that better? Can you hear us? You can hear now? Can you hear?
No, I can't.
You may want to turn it the right
Dr.
direction.
Winter's fine, but I don't know, I can't hear.
You know what, this might work. I'm gonna sit right here. And then we'll be ready for the mic. How's that?
That's much better. Thank you.
Okay. That's okay. All right, so the school-wide comprehensive planning process was already engaged when we launched, when we determined that, when we learned that we had the TSI designation. And so it was good timing in that sense, because we were already working through that process as building by building. Each building was working on a school-wide plan that would then feed into our district comprehensive plan. So the process that the IU recommends to go through is really following that same comprehensive school planning process. And so there's a template that PDE provides that provides the agenda, that guides us through some questions and some processes that take us deeply into the data. So I don't know how many of you had a chance, the actual plan is attached to the agenda for today. And I'm not one to want to read things to people, but I want to capture just a few important items that led to the specific designation for this. Related to our population of special education, which is the subgroup identified, the subgroup to be identified has to have at least 20 people in it. So for instance, our English learner population is not large enough to be identified in that sort of scenario, but our special education population is. There were then 3 specific things related to that. The first was achievement for math and English language arts combined, with a total of 30.85% proficiency. Our growth score was a negative 5.01 related to our PBOS growth, and our graduation rate for this population was 73.72. So in comparison to the 90% of our overall population, that then teases out the specifics of that special education population. So from there, we gathered a team, and the team was really a cross-representation of the high school, across departments, district representation, special education representation, counseling, teachers, across the board. That group spent a full day piled in the conference room looking at all the data sources that we could really get our hands on. We dove into the Future Ready Index in great depth. We dove into all of the Keystone data through eMetric. We looked at growth data. We looked at lengthier achievement data. We really dug into all the different data sources that we could to try to dig into the source of the root of this problem. The process itself has us identify what are our strengths and what are our weaknesses, and then really take it steps farther into root cause analysis of those challenges. The importance of identifying strengths is there because it gives us something to tie to. Just as when we teach kids, we want to tie what they are learning to what they already know, we want to look at what was going well that we can capitalize on and continue forth and help to build these kids to increase proficiency, to increase their skills, to increase their transition, to increase their graduation rate, to improve attendance, all of the factors that we know are going to contribute to more students being successful. So in going through that process, we summarized those strengths and challenges, we did that root cause analysis, and from there, it branched off. And that point, the TSI process became one part, and the school planning for the larger comprehensive plan was just kind of paused at that point as Dr. Miner was coming on, as all the buildings were completing their plans, and we were ready to then continue into the next part of that phase of the comprehensive plan. The TSI plan was truly birthed from that and that group and that data digging. And from there, I'm going to pass the baton over to Mr. Campbell, who will go into more depth about those strengths and challenges. But I'll pause there if there's any questions about the process.
Yeah, I have a question, but it goes way back to the beginning. You said, Dr. Winters, that you were confident that the teaching wasn't the problem. You described our teachers as amazing. I wouldn't disagree with that, but what data did you compile that gives you that confidence that the teaching is
So, in response to that question, Mr. Fiddler, yeah, sorry, I'm getting back to the front, sorry. In response to that question, there are a couple things that I look at. I've had the opportunity in my time since I've been here to be in classrooms, to do walkthroughs, to see teachers teaching on a pretty consistent basis. Not as much this past year, but in my first 2 years here. And I see fantastic instruction. I see kids learning. I see kids engaged. I see us using formative assessment. I see us integrating technology effectively with the Chromebooks and those kinds of things. I also know that while a PSSA or a Keystone is the predominant metric that is used to measure the effectiveness of a student, I also know that it's one metric. And so I think to jump to a conclusion and say that just based on a PSSA score, that's indicative of what teachers are or aren't doing instructionally, that's just not a leap that I'm confident to make. I don't see anything instructionally that leads me to believe that this is an instructional issue. I think there are other things, be it resources, curricular alignment, looking at course sequencing at the secondary level, opportunities for kids, those kinds of things.
Okay, thank you.
Absolutely. So I will hand things off to Mr. Campbell, who will talk about strengths and weaknesses.
Thank you, Mrs. Devon, for that first introduction. I just want to summarize some of what is in that PSI plan. As was mentioned, with any improvement planning, we looked at strengths and weaknesses and tried to capitalize on the former. Out of that committee's analysis of what we looked at in that data, we identified that our work at the high school in college and career readiness, that's our chapter 339 planning, is very strong and very much on target. Generally with all students, but in particular students with disabilities exceeded the benchmark, and another subgroup that's going to be mentioned tonight, students with economically disadvantaged, we're on track. We're meeting our current goals for achievement in ELA, biology, and math, and we have strong growth in biology and algebra, but even within the subgroups that we're going to be focusing on with this PSI, economically disadvantaged students and students with disabilities, we're on track, we're exceeding in that as a strength. And the team also cited perceptual data that the district offers and facilitates quality PD for teachers. Some of the challenges that we really need to focus on in our support, broadly, our ELA growth is poor. And that is something that we've known and been working on. And in examining the subgroups, students with disabilities and economically disadvantaged students, they are underperforming and need to be targeted for support. Students with disabilities did not meet achievement targets in tested areas, and were below growth targets in both biology and ELA. And our overall 4-year graduation rate, as already mentioned, is poor. And both subgroups that were mentioned is students with disabilities and economically disadvantaged students are not meeting the state targets. So we need to get more students. This is not part of the TSA, but emerged out of our analysis and part of the comprehensive planning. Also need to get more students into higher level courses and really focus on some of the achievement highest levels too. I think I'm turning it over to
Mr. Campbell,
Dr. Winters.
can you repeat that last sentence in maybe a different way? I don't think I understood that.
So it's, that last part, it came out of our analysis with that group. It really isn't part of the TSI, but we also have a need for targeting students who are or should be achieving at the highest level. So we don't have enough students who are achieving advanced in some of our tested areas. And that needs to be a focus of our attention as well.
Now, did I hear you make a connection between them in higher classes like
I'm glad to hear that, Tom, because one of the 3 legs of the stool that resulted in the Exeter High's rank of 14 in the latest U.S. News and World Report rankings was the deficiencies in the AP program, both AP courses and AP tests. Is
absolutely right. That is certainly an item that we are focusing on. It's not part of the TSI, in particular, because that falls outside that designation, but it is, you're absolutely right that that's an area of concern and focus.
Okay, and, one of the things I learned in management was, in fact, I started learning it in grad school. There's nothing wrong with copying what someone else does as long as you give them credit for it, particularly if it's something good. Have we gone to the top 3 districts, the top 3 high schools in Berks County, Wyomissing, Wilson, and Boyertown, just to see what they're doing right, and then copy it?
I don't, we've not analyzed that in terms of AP, and I would say that we haven't really spoken to them specifically about the TSI, but that would be worth talking to them about whether there's some of the particular areas that we have to focus on with TSI would be areas that they have had to address and may be able to give us some ideas.
Okay, good, because I think we shouldn't be shy about looking toward those who are doing better than we are to beg, borrow, or steal what they're doing so that we can help our kids.
Agreed.
Okay, thank you.
Mr. Aaron, you were,
Yeah, the only question I thought I heard you say was that there was a connection between the higher level classes that students are taking and the students who should be achieving higher. I don't know if I misheard that, but did I?
I don't want to try to tie those too closely, I can't necessarily say that for sure,
Okay.
but I do think that there is it's not a difficult leap that students who are in higher level courses are having expectations raised for them.
Okay, so it's not just students who are capable of being in the honors classes who are now in academic, it's also students who are in the honors classes who should be achieving higher.
We need to figure out why those students who aren't achieving higher levels aren't. And I think some of those exist in both places.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Campbell. If I could just circle back, Mr. Fiddler, just a second to the question that you asked. While we have not visited those buildings, we have collected data around not only the top schools in Berks County, but also 7 of the top 10 schools in the PA US News ranking. And we do know what those districts' graduation rates are. We do know how many AP courses they offer and what courses those are. And I've also done some analysis and I've identified there are about 10 other districts in Pennsylvania that are equal to Exeter in terms of our budget, our enrollment, and our percent of free and reduced students. And so now that we've identified who those districts are across the state, it'll allow us to dig a little bit deeper on those websites and find out, what are they doing as far as credit requirements for graduation, those kinds of things. And as I said earlier, part of kind of the purpose of tonight's presentation is to kind of begin to lay some groundwork so that when we come back at December, January curriculum committee meetings, we can talk with you about things like scheduling, credit requirements, alignment, those kinds of things that we believe, if we make some adjustments to them, will help us begin to attack some of these problems and improve upon them. So when you think about the goals and the priorities for the TSI plan, we really looked at 3 priorities and goals that went along with it. And the first one was really examining all of our students at the high school, but especially students with IEPs. And in terms of how are we meeting their needs from a human capital standpoint, from a scheduling standpoint, from an academic alignment standpoint, and just really preparing them to be successful. And so our goal related to that was we recognized very easily that if students are going to be successful in school, they have to attend. They have to be at school. And while it's not always the case, sometimes our students with IEPs also struggle to come to school with regularity. And so we looked at that attendance and looked at our students with IEPs in 18-19, 80.5% of them attended school on a day-to-day basis. We want to increase that number to 100%. We want those kids in school every day. So that's the goal, and provide additional support, and I think most importantly, build in scheduling opportunities to where those students will want to come to school every day because there is something that is creating excitement for them. I was communicating with with Ms. Broadhead earlier today, we have a specific transitional plan document in place related to work study. And we're taking a look at if we can increase work study opportunities for students with IEPs and they come to school every day and know that a portion of their schedule is, work related and they can get credit for that, that's gonna increase their attendance and their enthusiasm to wanna graduate. The second area we looked at was the graduation rate piece in particular, which Mr. Campbell touched on. And currently, as we said, the graduation rate as a district is 90%, but with students with IEPs, it's 74. So again, recognizing that's something we need to tackle, we need to get that number up to 100%, and recognizing that as an interim target, maybe try to get to 93 and then build from there. One of the challenges that exists at times with students with IEPs is some of them need to stay and through their 21st birthday because of their needs. But again, 74%, nowhere near where it needs to be. We should be a good 25% higher than that number, even for that population as well.
Dr. Weir, even if they do stay those additional years to 21, they're still counting that full.
They're not.
Not count with that cohort.
No, they don't count with their cohort because they don't finish in 4 years. So.
So that counts as, where are you looking at that as, a less graduate time because of that?
Yeah, because they're taking 5 years or 6 years or whatever is needed to, graduate. And that's why this is often districts that receive a CSI, an ATSI, or a TSI designation in a certain building. This is an area often that shows up in a lot of districts because of that, age 21 component for students with IEPs. So, but again, we're not using that as an excuse. We're not using that as a crutch. And Mrs. Harris, Ms. Broadhead have some great ideas about what we can do through those school to work opportunities and other things. And myself and Mr. Campbell and Mrs. Harris had a meeting with the school counselors. I guess it's been about a month ago now, Mr. Campbell. And one of the things that we said to the school counselors in that meeting is that nothing is off the table. You be creative. You know your kids. You know what it will take to get them to graduate. So you come to us and say, Dr. Winters, Mr. Campbell, whatever, this is what we need to do. And then we'll figure out a way to help you make that happen. And then the final goal is related to achievement and growth. And when we look at our achievement with students with IEPs related to this plan, literature was only 32% and Algebra 1 was only 30%. Very, very, very concerning and disturbing numbers. And so in looking at that, again, we set the bar high, right? We're gonna strive for 100% because we believe our kids can get there. And so, thinking about, and again, I think that's where the scheduling piece comes in. What kind of supports are our kids getting to be successful in Algebra 1 and in literature in terms of reading? We're due to realign English curriculum. It's a great time to be able to do that at the high school right now. And we look at our data and we know that what we're doing right now is not working, so it needs to be changed. And Mrs. Devon and I are taking steps to work with the department chair and Mr. Campbell to make that happen. And then lastly, growth. So when you think about growth and that acronym PVAS, Pennsylvania Value Added Assessment System, one of the misnomers about growth is that people think if kids are growing a year for a year, that's great. That's great if they come in on grade level. But if they come in and they're multiple grade levels behind, growing a year for a year, they aren't any further along at the end of that year than they were when the year started. So in terms of a goal related to this number, we want students with our IEPs to grow more than a year for a year, 2 years, 3 years potentially, because that's how they'll get caught up. A year for a year just isn't gonna do it. So with those goals, the last part of the TSI plan is action steps, and so I'm gonna ask Ms. Broadhead to come up here and talk to you guys about the action steps related to this plan.
Okay, so based on the strengths and challenges that we had as well as the goals that we set, we came up with 4 action steps to start this process. Our first step was increasing support in grades 9 through 10 in regular education classes at the high school. In the past, the focus has really just been the 3 Keystone tested areas. So it was Algebra 1, biology, and 10th grade literature. And this year, Mr. Campbell and I were able to figure out some ways to get support in 9th and 10th grade across all 4 subject areas. It is the least restrictive environment for our students. We want to see them in regular ed.
You hear clearly.
Sorry, I'll try to sit down. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. So, we increased support classes for all 9th and 10th grade in regular education classes, to give those students that support in regular ed, in the regular ed curriculum. We'll continue to work with regular education and special education teachers to train them, pushing more towards that co-taught environment for our students to be successful. Our second step was providing additional supports to students through various media. We have a few different websites that we're using and programs to build student skills. There's about 5 of them listed on the plan. One of the ones that we're using for all special education students this year is Reading Plus. It is an intervention program for literacy. We've been working with students on that. We're excited to see where the data goes on that, to see if that's something long-term that can help our students improve their skills. Learning Ally is another one. With the help of the foundation, we were able to fund that for this year, for our students to be able to have access to different reading material, whether it's books for pleasure or textbooks. It allows them to have that text read to them as well and access higher level materials then. Our third step, action step, was really looking at students from all different areas. So there's a few different bullets there, but what it all comes down to is having counselors, principals, special education teachers, our SAP coordinator, really looking at all of these students and what is the best situation for them individually. We're doing SAP referrals for students that are in danger of dropping out and having our SAP coordinator involved, really looking at credit analysis for all of our IEP students. We've analyzed every senior that has an IEP this year and where are they at, what do they need, looking at different opportunities for them to earn those credits that they need for graduation, looking at credit recovery options, really focusing on the transition plan and their IEP. And then the last one is continued training for special education staff specifically on the transition plans. We're incorporating some different assessments now for students to really get a good idea of what is their plan after high school and how can we help them achieve that, as well as incorporating some training from our legal counsel on the transition planning process in IEPs. Those are our 4 action steps that we have as part of our TSI plan.
Thank you, Ms. Profit. Appreciate that.
There's a trivial question.
So just to kind of bring some closure to the conversation related to the TSI plan, just to let you know what happens as far as next steps. So that plan is on the workshop agenda for this evening. It's under curriculum committee. And so the board will be approving that plan at the voting meeting next week. And then once that plan is approved, that basically continues the clock and starts the clock, so to speak, with us as a district to make sure that when the 2021 data comes out related to students with IEPs, that we have reached our goals or at least above the state benchmarks in those areas to come out of TSI. So, reaching the benchmarks, from my perspective, that's a foregone conclusion. That's not gonna, that's gonna happen. I don't care about just meeting the benchmarks. I wanna blow the benchmarks out of the water. I wanna exceed them. And so that's what we're gonna strive for. And then once we get the 2021 data back, I would come back to you probably next fall at some point, and then let you know, here was, kind of review the plan again, here's the data that supports that we no longer have that TSI designation any longer. And it's not a designation we ever want to have again. As a district, you never want any of your buildings or any of your populations to cause you to be in CSI, ATSI, or TSI. Because when there's any group of learners whose needs aren't being met, that's a failure. And we never want to be failing any of our learners, regardless of population or need. So let me pause there. Are there any questions related to the TSI plan?
Have we had this designation before?
Actually, I have a few dozen, but I won't do it here. But anyway, just like to know, A, have we talked to the kids, and B, how are we engaging with the families? And not in the senior year, but earlier, all along the child's education, how are we engaging with the families to make sure that if the parents aren't engaged, we encourage them to get engaged, and if they refuse to be engaged, then we have to somehow jump in and continue that education for them when they're not in school. Those are my two concerns. Thank you.
Those are two really good questions, Mr. Fiddler. I think we're doing a better job of talking to kids and families while they're here as they struggle along the way than we are reaching out to them once they've graduated to ask, how did we, fail you? What wasn't successful for you when you were here? That piece is something we can do a better job of. I know Mr. Ahrens has brought that up before in meetings about, what does our communication look like with our graduates? Not just those that are successful, but those that struggle as well. I think that's a really valuable piece, and I think it's something that we definitely need to do a better job of. But in terms of the students that are here, what you just described, Mr. Fiddler, is something that we've already started being much more disciplined about this year, that with our students with IEPs in particular, having those conversations at IEP meetings when kids talk about wanting to drop out or parents bring that up, making sure that, that just doesn't happen and that they have to talk to any number of different people, that we layer in all the supports that we possibly can, whether it's school counselor, special ed case manager. And one of the things that we've been very specific with this year is we have a list of all of our students that are at risk of not graduating this year. And we've already said to our school counselors, start reaching out to these kids, make sure that you're talking to them, that we're being creative, we want to get them graduated, and that's really important. And so we're kind of starting with our seniors and working our way back. And because you're right, really, we have a sense of who some of these kids might be as early as 9th grade. And so to begin to identify that early is important.
Okay, great. Thank you very much.
Mrs. Wilson, to your question, I know we haven't had that designation since I've been here, and it'll be 3 years for me in January. I don't know prior to that if we've had that designation. I don't believe so, but not to my knowledge. Dr. McClendon.
So you said that you have a list of some students that you're looking at. How is that list comparing to previous lists? I'm thinking about with our virtual, first quarter virtual learning and things like that. Are you seeing more students on that list because of that?
Yeah,
What's going on?
I'll let Mr. Campbell handle that because this is something he was talking about earlier today in a meeting we were in.
Yeah, yes. I think this year's been
Sorry, I don't mean to be a pain, but could you please repeat the questions before you answer them? Thank you.
The question, Mr. Fiddler, was the list that I referenced related to students that we know that are at risk. Dr. McClendon asked if that list has grown or is larger this year because of virtual learning. Mr. Campbell's answering that question.
Yes, so I think every school is struggling with connecting with its students, more than ever. So I think it's difficult to compare those lists from year to year, but I think we see some similarities in that what leads to those at-risk students is disengagement from school. That doesn't happen in 1 week or a month. That's something that evolves over years, and that's part of what we need to get better at is recognizing those risk factors earlier on and loosening some of the opportunities that we have to address those risk factors earlier so that we can, as we talked about, get creative with some of the approaches to that.
I'll repeat the answer when he's done.
But to your question, Dr. McClendon, I think we have seen an increase in students who are at risk because of just our struggle to connect with them. And also, I think, related to their own personal situations at home. I mean, many of these kids are in families where they're working or there's been disruption. All of us have seen disruption in our families. It's very, very difficult to generalize on that.
Okay, thank you.
So what the answer was, Mr. Fiddler, was that we have seen those numbers go up. Connectedness is certainly much harder when you have kids that are learning virtually. And a lot of our kids that are learning virtually, especially at the high school level, they have additional responsibilities along with school during the day, whether it's working a job, helping care for younger siblings, whatever the case may be. So we have seen an uptick with that list because of that. Dr. Herring?
Thank you.
When you use the term school counselor, do you mean guidance counselor?
Yes.
Okay. In the high school, how many guidance counselors do we have? And how many students do they take care of?
Well, there's 1,300 in the building. Their caseload's right around 260, 270.
Do we feel like that's a good number for them to be able to take care of all those kids in a way that we feel is best? I'm sorry, I'm trying to say what I mean without. you
Without
understand
leading the
what I mean?
witness. Yeah, I think that that's a question that, schools wrestle with in terms of, counselor to student ratio. It's not something that we've explored as a team here, and I think it's one of those things that we don't wanna equate necessarily the number of counselors to the number of students as, the reason that we're struggling to connect during a quarantine. But it's definitely something that among all of the things that we're looking at, which is pretty much inclusive of everything, to get those graduation rates up, how we're staffed at every building, will be on the table. In terms of, Mr. Campbell's own opinion about that, you can share it or not, but I think the question of whether or not, there's an exact ratio, there's guidance that's set out by like the counselors, state association, that sort of thing, on the appropriate student to counselor ratio. I think the other question that, again, is raised in multiple districts, and having been a pupil services director, it's certainly something that I oversaw previously, is you look at an elementary school, where you might have 400, 500 students and one counselor, versus high school where you have, a 1 to 300 ratio, the demands of college counseling versus not college counseling, the demands of little kids who are, crying at school. It's a really big issue that I think is best explored at the whole of the K-12 spectrum, in terms of what, the school board and the administration, wishes to have in terms of a student counselor ratio. Because I think you're hitting the tip of an iceberg on a much bigger question, Dr. Herring, in terms of what's the appropriate amount of counseling support in any scenario, let alone in a pandemic. And I think it goes to what's the appropriate amount of social work support. Some schools have college-specific counselors, other schools have counselors specific to work with students who are in, IEPs and having transitions. So I think it's a very big, question. I don't want to give short trips to it this evening without, us really digging in and having, maybe even a presentation unique to that one night at curriculum. So Mr. Campbell, I interrupted you off.
No, I think you touched on it. It's a complex point, and counselors' roles are to support students in their academic progress, but they are one of many people who have that role and responsibility. And we see that shift, and we've seen that shift happen in the last 7 months, as our SAP coordinator, our social worker have taken on increased responsibilities, and our counselors have really become more social workers than academic counselors in a lot of ways. We've all had to reprioritize in the last 7 months, and even more broadly back to the normal, back in pre-COVID or pre-pandemic situation. I think it also still points to it is a part of a larger system, and it would be, I think we would really need to look at it in the context of that system to answer that question.
So to kind of summarize, Mr. Fiddler, the question was related to school counselors and how many school counselors we have at the high school. We have 5, and then we talked a little bit about student to counselor ratio. It's about 265 and 270, and just the complexities of whether or not additional school counselors are needed. It's a much more complex question, probably warrants a separate presentation in and of itself. But we definitely are utilizing them to meet the needs of kids right now. Whether or not more are needed, that's a bigger question for a different time.
Okay, thank you very much.
Were there any other questions related to the TSI? Yes, Dr.
Well, this
McCarthy.
isn't a TSI, but it was what Dr. Herring, when she said, school counselors, is that the same as guidance counselors?
Correct.
And some of you heard me talk about this before, but I think at least 20 years ago, it was changed from guidance counselor to school counselor. And as you heard them all talking about the role and functions of school counselors, that's why it changed. also, really, I know that a lot of schools haven't done it, they continue to call school counselors guidance counselors, but it's really the correct name is school counselor.
Thank
Your wife's a
you.
school counselor, right, Mr. Campbell?
Yes.
So that's why you know the school.
Thank you, because it is referred to that in
And a
the
lot
high
of schools
school.
still have it, they have it, I mean, where I was working, they had guidance on our department, and
Right.
really, that changed, it changed, I would say at least 20 years ago.
Thank you.
So the last
Do
piece
you want to
that,
summarize that for Mr. Devon?
oh, yes, I'm sorry. So Mr. Fiddler, the last, comment was just, Dr. McClendon was explaining kind of how the name school counselor evolved from guidance counselor, and that change occurred about 20 years ago. But that a lot of districts have been slower to make that shift in language. But the term is school counselor because of the increased nature of the role now compared to what it was 20, 25 years ago.
So they're still doing what guidance counselors did at Exeter 50 years ago?
And more, and much more, and much more.
All right, thank you.
Are there any other questions either related to data or related to the TSI plan before I get to the last piece of the evening? So you heard me say at the beginning of the evening that this is three legs of a triangle that go together. The data helps paint a picture of why there's a crisis and why it's something that we need to fix. When we dig into that crisis and we look at it at a subgroup level, we recognize at the high school in particular, we have a group of students, our students with IEPs, who were not meeting their needs to the fullest extent possible. And to circle back, you've all heard Dr. Miner say before, and as something all of us have said often, that it starts with reading, the most basic skill. If students aren't literate in the elementary grades, we're setting them up for significant failure as they move on throughout their high school career. So I just have 2 slides. I want to talk to you for a few minutes about 2 additional Fountas and Pinnell resources that are on the workshop agenda tonight for approval next week that we'd like to use grant funding. I'm going to give a brief introduction for each one, and then I'll let Mrs. Devlin and Dr. Miner, share any thoughts that they might have related to each of those. So the first one is the interactive read aloud. We purchased Fountas and Pinnell Classroom, as you guys know, guided reading and shared reading libraries. Earlier in the year, we used ESSER funds to be able to do that, and that was about a $217,000 purchase. And then our teachers, they fell in love with it. I'm sure Mrs. Mel could speak to what an amazing tool it has been for her. And so it caused us to begin to look at what would the next piece be. And that next piece is the interactive read aloud piece. So I'm going to let Mrs. Devlin talk a few minutes about interactive read aloud. Dr. Miner, if you want to jump in then and add anything, please feel free. Yeah.
In many ways, it feels like Dr. Miner came and brought us a big puzzle. And now we put the border on as we purchase things like the guided reading libraries and the other pieces that our teachers have received so far. We've done some training with them, provided them with, Dr. Winters, could you hold up that book right there? Oh, stop. We purchased them the reading mini lessons books for our teachers, which are great resources to help our teachers look at specific skills, dive into those skills, and there are some books that also can accompany those as well. So the next step of the puzzle, we've got the border on, we've figured out where the water is, and now we need to build the sky. So the next step to this is really bringing that library in to the puzzle so that teachers really have those materials right there at their hands. When they're looking at these mini lesson books, the lessons are incredible, and they really follow a nice application of skills process, and they help kids summarize and apply the strategies and skills they're working on to texts that they see in front of them. Kids have opportunities to share, extend their learning, but what we haven't necessarily done is put the books that specifically can support that right in teachers' hands. So they might have a great idea for this mini lesson, but then they need to go out and find a text. So the goal is to take some of that out of teachers' planning time and let them dig in more to the specific skills and strategies they're working on teaching. So now they can take that mini lesson and just grab the books off the shelf that they need and really dig into the teaching of that lesson. So if you're nodding, do you want to add anything to that?
I don't know that that they'll be able to hear me on Zoom, but, I'm so excited for the resources, and it is such a fantastic program. Thank you so much for bringing it and all the, support that we've gotten through training. Right now, because I'm the virtual teacher, it's been a little bit of a challenge. I have used FMP Library digitally, but it's not the same as the kids having the books in their hands. So I'm eager to, when we go back to normal, get those books in the kids' hands. But I'm so excited for all the resources and, Fontes and Pinnell, anything with their name on it, I'm all in, so.
Exactly. Mr. Fiddler, Tiff Mell, our teacher representative, was just sharing how great the resources have been that we have provided so far, and the excitement over the continuation of the next step in the overall process. So the interactive read aloud purchase does come to a total of $77,000 across the 3 buildings, and we have grant funds that will be supporting that. Those are ESSER funds, if I'm correct. And that will allow our teachers to have the text version of the books. Our wonderful rep that Dr. Miner has set us up with is getting us online access even in advance of that. So our teachers probably by the end of the week, and Tiff will be happy to hear this, the virtual teachers especially, there should be online access by the end of the week.
Can I just add a little bit to the interactive read aloud? I think the desire of teachers to get it did stem from the mini lessons book, and in the mini lessons book they use a lot of those texts, to teach lessons from. But the interactive read aloud themselves have their own lessons, and they're actually an entirely different piece of instruction, which is the idea that teachers read text to students that they can't access themselves because they're at a higher reading level than students can access with their own reading abilities. And that's really fundamental and important to developing literacy because, and just making connections in your brain, because you can take in so much more information through your ears than you can through your eyes when you're a student who's just learning how to read. So it's really about, challenging students, introducing them to genres and themes and text structures, a variety of authors. These materials too have been really important as we work with our Equity and Excellence Committee and really look at curriculum that is fully inclusive and representational of a variety of authors and illustrators and cultures and those sorts of things. So that will be an addition to our classrooms that I think is really significant. To have teachers reading aloud to students, engaging students in discussions, again, at higher level text than they can access on their own. And then it serves double duty as being the mentor text or sample text in a lot of the lessons that are contained in the mini lessons book. So this is really a cornerstone piece of the entirety of the Fontes and Pinnell classroom. So I just didn't want it, I think if you're thinking about it just as books that teachers can use to teach mini lessons, there are other books teachers can use, but it has this entire other level of import in terms of that whole picture of reading comprehension.
And it really focuses on these umbrellas of text. So it may introduce a whole author study or a whole genre study, and that helps kids really make those connections between the things they know and the things that they're learning as well. So those connections are really important, and thank you for bringing up the piece. I have a specific note for that second bullet point that we really want to make sure that we're introducing literature at all levels where kids are seeing themselves represented in the literature that they're reading. And so that second bullet point was a really important one that I also wanted to highlight, so thank you. Any questions about this specific portion? Okay. Then the other piece of this that we've talked about, and as grant funds have been great. It's been wonderful to have grant funding really available throughout the course of this year. The phonics and word study component of the Fontes and Pinnell classroom is a fairly logical next step to the growth of our students beyond foundations in grade 2. So it follows, Fontes and Pinnell's phonics and word study program follows a very similar approach to the way we tackle grammar and those sorts of things already in terms of inquiry. So that instead of just teaching a student a pattern, we're asking a student to identify, what do you notice about these words? What patterns do you see? What impact does that have? And I am such a staunch believer in that inquiry approach, helping kids really make sense of their learning and engage with their learning because their curiosity is still impacted. And I think so easily when we think about phonics and word study and spelling, when I go back to my own schooling, I do not have fond memories of spelling. I remember memorizing lists. I remember my parents quizzing me. But when we approach spelling in terms of looking for patterns and things that are the same about words and really investigating words, we come at it from a whole different approach, and kids embrace that in a whole different way. So this is something that we're looking to purchase, and work towards determining how we'll be implementing it as we move forward in securing our foundations instruction and making sure that this is the logical next step out.
If I could just add, about the phonics and word study, this, in my previous district was something that I thought teachers would like the least, it would be the least engaging, and they actually loved it. It was one of the parts that they enjoyed the most. It is extremely hands-on, the approach. It's not that simple memorization of spelling lists, that sort of things. Kids really are physically interacting with words, cutting them apart, putting them back together, doing all kinds of things. And I think the teachers were shocked that you could make learning vocabulary, studying words, so engaging for older kids in particular, when it's usually seen as more of a chore. So I think this is exciting in that perspective.
And this purchase for grades 3 through 5 will be about $17,542
I just want to say, when I heard about this from Dr. Winters and Ms. Devon last week, I was really excited about having been, kind of feel like, I'm not teaching now, but I was an elementary teacher, so when I saw these components to our literacy program, I was really excited because we looked at our scores that were presented earlier, and we have got to get really good resources in the hands of our teachers, in order to be able to do something about that. And so when teachers have the right resources, it's going to transfer to our students, improving. And I also want to thank Dr. Miner and the team for being creative and finding ways to fund this without increasing our budget. Thank you for doing that.
I just have a quick question, and maybe this is kind of basic for me, and I should have asked this earlier. But in terms of these resources, how are they used to benefit the students in the classroom? Like, how does that actually start or happen, or how are
So the question, Mr. Fiddler, can you hear me?
Mr. Fiddler, can you hear Dr. Miner?
No, I haven't heard anything for the last 7 or 8 minutes.
Okay, so you're gonna have to relay, but
Okay.
I'll answer.
I'll relay.
Okay, I'll answer the question. So in terms of how they benefit students, first and foremost, I think if you think about your own life as a student or as a reader, as a consumer of media, we all want things that are engaging, that capture our interests, right? That are appropriate for our reading ability or for our interests, those sorts of things. So when you have materials like we previously had, and I'll let Mrs. Mel speak to this, and the principal in the room, because I obviously haven't been here, but that are photocopied black and white pieces of paper. That's not engaging, right? That's not beautiful colored, illustrated text, those sorts of things. If you have limited topics, so that if you're in my class, Hunter, and you're really interested in animals, and Renee's in my class and she's really interested in sports, do I have a choice of topics that will engage you both as reluctant readers and make you want to read those books and learn those skills that you need in ways that you're interested in the topic, and so learning the skills is more enjoyable for you, right? Especially when you're a younger kid, that's a huge portion of that. So there's just kind of that immediate sense of, do I enjoy reading? Because the most important factor of being a successful reader or any skill is time on task, right? And so when we had the First in Math training, the trainer, the creator of First in Math, Dr. Soon, he talks about how when you look at things that have a high level of proficiency, like professional athletes or cellists in an orchestra, they spend very small amounts of time learning and a lot of time practicing. And we do the reverse in school. We spend a lot of time teaching and little bit of time practicing, right? So that's why First in Math is so important, because it's so much practice. It's the same thing with reading. The more kids do it, the better they get, which is why we want kids to read 20 minutes at night every night. The more that you enjoy it. So the more that we have engaging resources that are colorful, that kids can pick at their level, because if it's too hard for you, it's frustrating, and you learn that you're a bad reader. If it's too easy for you, you don't gain the skills that we need you to gain, right? So having a huge array that are right for you, right for Renee, right for Tiffany, that really matters in terms of, as a child, what I can consume. But also as a teacher, if I have the ability to go down and select a book for Hunter and a book for Renee, my focus then is on the student and I, and our interaction, and the book is a medium for that, versus my intention and focus and energy being finding a book that'll work for Hunter, that will work for Renee, and taking my time and thinking away from my planning and my interaction with you towards acquiring my resources, which ultimately is a drain for the kiddos in the class, because the teacher's attention where it really needs to be is student to teacher, not teacher to finding a resource. So I think ultimately that as well, is a critical piece of that. I don't know if you can summarize that briefly for me.
Yeah. I'm pretty good at doing that.
Plus books equals winners. Make sure you're emphasizing there's no budget increase, that they were created.
So Mr. Fiddler, to kind of summarize the last piece that we talked about, so there was a question from Mr. Ahrens about, how do these resources translate to, direct impact on kids in the classroom? And what Dr. Miner shared is that it really comes down to engagement. So with these resources, because of how high quality they are, and the pictures, and the topics, and the fact that they're leveled, kids are excited, and teachers can work with students to find books that are at their level and are at their area of interest. And, I almost use a comparison of, I still love to read books in hand as opposed to reading them digitally. And there's an excitement about going to the bookstore and buying a brand new book that you're really excited about, and you take it home. There's an enthusiasm there. Well, our kids are no different. You've got a kindergartner that sees these brand new books that are at their level, interesting topics. It really causes them to want to really get excited about reading, which is a lifelong skill. So that's basically a summary of what Dr. Miner shared.
Okay, thank you very much.
Sure.
You said something a minute ago that caught my attention. You said finding books at their level. One of my experiences, and it really helped throughout my 12 years at Exeter, was that our teachers always challenged us by giving us things to read that were just beyond our level. Are we doing that now in 2020? And how much are we doing that? Not just giving kids things to read that we know they can read, but challenging them by giving them the next level of book. What's I guess we now call them chapter books, which I think is a normal term. So once they read 2 or 3 or 4 chapter books, what are we doing at Exeter throughout from K to 12 to always be challenging our students so that they improve and learn?
Mr. Fiddler, I've come over by the computer personally for this one, because there's an exciting term in education that I know you as a reporter are gonna wanna write down. You ready for it? Okay, it's called Zone of Proximal Development, ZPD. Zone of Proximal Development is exactly what you described, which is what are you just now ready to learn? That's a little bit hard for you, but not so hard that you're gonna be frustrated by it, right? So Zone of Proximal Development, ZPD, is where we want to be in every subject all of the time, because it's what stretches our kids to grow, but doesn't frustrate them, right? So that's a really important target. It's extremely important in reading in particular, and it's a lot of what we do at the guided reading table, and why knowing what a student's reading level is so critically important, and then having the right text so that they can achieve success with those texts with the support of a teacher that they couldn't do independently. So we actually know what a student's independent reading level is versus their instructional reading level for specifically that reason, so that we can stretch them and have them grow. But in all aspects of school and all subjects, teachers need to be collecting data that is specific to that subject, so they know where that sweet spot is, that ZPD for kids, whether it's math or some other topic. So it's part of, I think, our important work going forward in all of our curriculum is how do we use formative assessment, summative assessment, data in general, not just to admire the data and say this is a label on this child. I think a lot of people think we get a level to communicate to parents or to label a child. The reason that we collect data is so that we can really target that ZPD for in all areas. And ultimately, that's what's gonna change all of the data that Dr. Winters presented earlier, is making sure that we're really using assessment as a tool for instruction, not for labeling kids.
Right, great, thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Are there any other questions related to anything that we discussed this evening?
I don't have a question, but I do wanna say, I have seen my teachers so excited at Owatin with their like, where are these books? I'm looking for a book, where can I find it? Can I help volunteer to set up our F&P guided library? I've literally had teachers stay after school to just get everything together. So I think that excitement that we see in them also breeds in the students, and we all know that if the students see that, that'll happen. So I'm very grateful for that, and it's great to see.
So, Mr. Fiddler, just to share something that Mrs. Coble just shared, at Owatin Creek, her teachers are so incredibly excited about these Fountas and Pinnell resources. They're eager to get the books out, get them set up. They're staying after school. They're setting up the libraries. There's just a real excitement at that building.
And I would like to add,
Sounds like Jackson World 55 years ago.
well, now I'm gonna add something from Jacksonville, Mr. Fiddler. I had the pleasure of just today talking with a teacher. We're getting ready for an observation and guided reading. And the language that we were sharing back and forth in our pre-conference about reading and rereading, and how she used a lot of the language that she learned in the Fountas and Pinnell training was outstanding. Like, we were even debating, when is the best time to review vocabulary with kids? At the beginning before they read, or at the end when they read? And we had this great conversation that I found was so rich. And at the very end, she was like, this was so nice to sit and actually talk about this with you. And that conversation is leading for, one, motivation for students, because how do we get students to love to read? We know we read with our eyes, but we never learn to read. That's not how we really begin to read. We begin to read with the language. So that conversation and the way we're crafting questions, so that the questions are not just, who's the character? Not that that's not important, but we're going deeper with what do you notice about what the author is trying to tell you here? That kind of language, like, gives me goosebumps. I'm sweating. I need that deodorant that Dr. Meyer always talks about right now. Because that is that's what's going to build, I think, this graduation rate. We at the elementary level, and I'll take personal responsibility with this with my colleagues, that we have to develop a love for learning that carries through with them as they go through. So like, when I look at that graduation rate, I take personal responsibility. My job has to be to get kids to love to learn, and it starts with reading. Because we can't go through life if we don't know how to read. We can't become more knowledgeable if we don't have reading to get that information. So I'm super excited, super excited. So I hope that helps. Okay.
One thing I'd like to share from my teaching experience, something I noticed after teaching 6 years at RAC in Albernia was a loss of curiosity on the part of my students. You can blame it on technology, you can blame it on television, you can blame it on 150 different things. But if we at Exeter can continue to stoke our students' curiosity, they will want to learn. They will want to read that next important book. They will want to solve that math problem that maybe they don't really know how to solve, but they want to dig into it and try and solve it. And they can do that if we are teaching them that curiosity and asking lots of questions is the best way to learn.
Thank you, Mr. Fiddler. I completely agree. As you can see, everybody in the room, there's a ton of enthusiasm from staff members about these issues. And none of us are going to downplay that we have work to do, but I can tell you there's a pretty phenomenal team in place that is ready for the challenge, and they're going to do what needs to be done to make it happen. And so in the coming months at these meetings, you're going to hear additional presentations about very strategic steps that we're going to take to try to remedy some of these issues. And some of them may involve things like scheduling and credits and those kinds of things. Some of them may be financial in nature. I can tell you that if they're financial in nature, we're gonna try to use grants, if at all possible, to make those expenditures and not have to increase the budget in any way to be able to do that. But we are committed to fixing this, and it will get better. That I can promise you. So, thank you all for attending this evening. I appreciate it, and many of you I'll see in about 35 minutes at the board meeting.
Dr. McLennan, want to say?
Dr. McLennan, would you like to say
No, I
anything?
just wanted to thank everybody for coming out, and it is really nice to be in person. I'm one of the people who are a little bit, on the, let's just say, virtual side, so I'm really glad I decided to come and, to see everybody. And I'm so, like I said, I'm not teaching any longer, but when I hear these things that we're doing, coming out of curriculum now, I'm really excited for our teachers, because I know that that's gonna make a big difference, in what happens in those classrooms. So, just thank you all. Oh, I wanna say too, we made a couple changes in our times for our meetings, but, I think we're gonna stay with this, 5 o'clock, so it gives us 5 to 6:30, and gives us, a little cushion in between that and the, voting meeting, but, I know we changed a couple things over the past year, but this is probably what we're gonna stay with, and we're gonna stay in person as long as we can too. But thank you again.
Thank you, everyone.
Yeah.